our parents, and we can fool our friends, and we can talk very godly, and we can send godly emails. But if we don't obey God, it's all for naught, because you can't fool God. And also in James 4:17, it says that, therefore to him that knoweth to do good, and doeth it not, to him it is sin. So if the Lord has shown you something specifically to give to the poor, or if he's shown you to pay your tithes and offerings and not rob God, and you know to do good, but you don't do it, then it is sin unto you. And you need to repent of it, ask God to forgive you, and then do whatever it is he showed you to do. And that is how you get restored back to the Lord. And then there are some examples. There is good news in all this. There are some examples of those who do obey. And one of those examples is Daniel. And in Daniel 1:8, sometimes if we're going to obey God, we have to make up our mind in advance we're going to obey God. And that's what Daniel did. In Daniel 1:8 it says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So you can't just walk into a situation and all of a sudden be blindsided by it, because you might make the wrong choice. You have to make up your mind in your heart, I'm either going to obey the Lord or I'm not going to obey the Lord. You know, there's sometimes, I've said before, I don't know why people go to church if they're not going to obey God and follow him. Why don't they just go to the beach? I mean, you know, if you're not going to do what God says and you're just going to show up to church to be religious, you might as well be at the beach getting some sun, because God's not impressed. And but Daniel purposed in his heart that he was going to serve the Lord. And so, therefore, when all these issues and trials and tribulations and choices and temptations came, he had already made up his mind and determined what he was going to do before the situation even came up. So that's what we need to do and follow Daniel's example. Also, in Isaiah 1:19 it says, if ye be willing and obedient, ye shall eat the good of the land. So you can't just be willing. You have to be obedient also if you want to eat the good of the land. And so the results, we have the results of the ones that did not obey. And once again, I'll bring a little oil burner story into it. There was waste. We wasted our time and money. We wasted time, we wasted money, we wasted energy, and we wasted grief. I mean, just because we wanted to take it, we wanted the results of the expensive one, but we wanted it on a cheaper scale. And so we wasted all these things. And that's a silly example, but it's bringing it home. Abraham, it was waste again. They're still fighting wars over in Israel, as I said, because of his choice to go in unto Hagar. And then David, a man lost his life. It cost a man his life for their disobedience and for their lack of wanting to do things God's way. And but the results of the ones who did obey. Daniel, he was highly exalted, and he continued to hear from God. He continued to get revelations. He continued to interpret dreams. And he was raised up to a very high position, just as Joseph was. Joseph went through a lot of trials and tribulations, but ultimately he was the second in command under Pharaoh. And because of that, he was able to save his whole family alive in a time of famine. So sometimes the Lord will take one person out of a family or out of a community and put that person through a lot of trials and tribulations, so that when the famine comes, whether it's a famine of money, a famine of food, or a famine of the word of the Lord. There can be a famine of the word of the Lord. And he needs someone who has some corn. And Joseph had corn because of what his dreams and his interpretation of those dreams to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh raised him up, and he was able to save his whole family because he obeyed God. And God put him through a training time. And that's what we have to understand sometimes in our trials and tribulations. Those may be training for you that you may turn and help your brethren once you get through these things. And so once again, willing and obedient, in order to save the good, to eat the good of the land. The children of Israel wandered around for 40 years, and they were not able to enter into the land of milk and honey because they were disobedient to the Lord. And so the Lord let them wander around. They say it should have been an 11-day trip. It took them 40 years. And the reason it took them 40 years is because they were disobedient to God, and they kept murmuring against God, and the Lord was letting them all die off in the wilderness so that their children were able to enter. And the spies that gave a good report, which were Caleb and the others that gave a good report, were able to enter in. But the ones that murmured and did not obey God and did not give a good report, they were not able to enter in the land of milk and honey, the fruit of the land. So what I'm saying is, if you don't obey God, say for instance in tithe and offering, then you can't really expect God to bless your finances. And lots of people struggle in finances, and God can bless in other ways. He can bless in saving your children. He can bless in protection. He does not just bless in finances, but we cannot expect the promises of God to come into our life, the blessings of God to come into our life, if we've been trying to take shortcuts. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today, was the fact that you cannot take shortcuts in order to please the Lord. You must do it God's way. I think about Samuel. He was the man that God raised up to do things God's way. Eli's sons had both, slept with the temple harlots. They had not been obedient. Eli had not made them be obedient. And so there was no one to pass the torch to, no one to go forward. But the Lord had Samuel, Hannah had Samuel, and gave him to Eli. And Eli raised him up, and that was God's man for the hour. And so God always has a man for the hour. When it looks bleak and dark and you think there's no truth, you flip on Christian television and you sometimes don't see all the truth being preached. Or you may, visit many churches and not always see the truth being preached. But the Lord always has a person for the hour that is going to preach the truth. But it says in the last days that men will not be able to receive sound doctrine because they're going to be so deceived by seducing spirits and false prophets. So I encourage you today to obey the Lord and seek His face and to obey Him and ask Him to lead you into all truth. And He will do that if you ask Him to do that. I want to thank you for stopping by today and ask you to visit my website at www.asheepspeaks.org. And we have a donation button there and also a post office box. If you'd like to help us get on television, we'd really appreciate that, or help us stay on television. We would really appreciate that also. Thank you.